The long-awaited THQ Nordic title Biomutant is finally here. After years of hype and delays, I was eager to see just what this game was about and, more importantly, if it lived up to all the noise the industry seemed to be making for it. Originally announced back in 2017, this was THQ's foray into what felt more like a AAA game than a AA published game, and after playing it, I can see why. Biomutant comes from a newly formed studio mostly comprised of old Just Cause developers. Biomutant is their debut title, an open-world action RPG that, gameplay-wise, reminded me a lot of Breath of the Wild, but with way more customization and exploration features. But before we jump into this review, make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit the bell icon to stay up to date for whenever I upload another review. With all that said, let's jump into this review, starting with story. Biomutant takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where animals have evolved and mutated into these humanoid-like creatures and monsters. While a lot of time has passed between the different levels of mutations, what's left of the world now is but the remnants of what society used to be. Occasionally the game will throw you into flashbacks, helping you get a look at what the world looked like before and who you were before the fallout of all these mutations. It was fascinating to learn about, and oddly enough, reminded me a lot of Fallout New Vegas. You see, while there's a lot of story here that can be missed if you don't dive into the side quests or talk to the NPCs, the overarching narrative is about the Tree of Life. It's this gigantic tree in the middle of the world that planted its roots across the about 5x5 mile open world. At each one of these roots is a world eater. There are these gigantic mutated monsters that are eating up the roots of the tree, slowly killing it in the process. That's the main questline, which in itself was pretty okay, but I found myself gravitating towards a more humanity-driven quest with the NPCs. You see, you can beat Biomutant roughly in about 10 hours if you just rush through the campaign, and while normally I would do that for this review, Biomutant caught my eye enough to explore more and more. Suddenly I realized I was a lot of hours into this game, still hadn't beaten the game, and the review embargo was coming up. Sadly, the more time I put into it though, I slowly realized a lot of the plot holes Biomutant had, both in regards to its main and side quests. Often these stories failed to show, not tell, and left a shallow impression of what could have been a marvelous story. It's hard to define what Biomutant is because there are so many elements to it. It's an action RPG with a ton of exploration in an open world, but the combat reminds me of DMC. The branching narrative options along with the different tribes you can side with remind me a lot of Fallout New Vegas. It's a lot honestly, but it's kind of good. Upon starting Biomutant, you'll be asked to pick your character's breed. These breeds act as different classes that preset your attributes. You might be stronger, smarter, or more agile. Ultimately, the choice is yours. After that, you're able to mutate your character to more finely make them fit the preset you'd like. This is done by actively changing the meter that changes your character's physique based on the selection you make. For example, choosing intelligence will make your character's head bigger, while making them stronger will have them bulk up. It's an ingenious way to make these choices feel more authentic and impactful. Don't worry though, it's not completely set in stone. In fact, as you play through Biomutant, you'll get a handful of opportunities to upgrade and mutate your character to fit your playstyle. It's an incredibly in-depth RPG that spreads across character customization, power upgrades, and weapon modifications. I'll dig into that in a bit because we have to talk about this open world. Biomutant takes place in a post-apocalyptic world years after these animals could already walk and talk like humans, now mutated to the point of being completely unrecognizable. Unlike how most apocalyptic worlds are portrayed, this world is quite beautiful. Sure, there's debris everywhere, biohazardous waste in the forest, but the way the world is portrayed is shockingly pretty. It's a nice change of pace from the usual dull yellow-brown color palette these end-of-the-world games tend to lean on. Spread across the 8km by 8km world, that's again 5 miles by 5 miles for those of you in the west, you'll explore across multiple terrains and tribes, each with their own agendas. Some tribes actively seek out wanting to hunt down the world eaters, saving the Tree of Life, while other tribes have adopted the world without organization and would rather let the chaos continue. It's one of the many choices you'll have to make in this world relating back to the karma system. You see, there are multiple endings that are shaped between the choices you make, resulting in either light or dark karma. This is just the main line of the story though. Beyond that, there's plenty of other side quests here for you to do that can easily bloat up the runtime of this game. There's plenty of incentives too, as talking to an NPC can result not only in a whole new storyline, but new powers, new weapons, heck you can even find an NPC that lets you change your character's look all over again. All of this reinforces the idea that while you can beat this game in a short amount of time, you should honestly spend as much time as you can investigating, finding the right materials for a new weapon, collecting resources to upgrade your attacks, and so much more. I'm sure I'll miss something in this review as there's a lot to cover, like being able to unlock new powers, learn specific new combos, modify existing weapons into completely new ones. Further expanding on the world exploration are vehicles you can unlock from a giant mech suit to a ski jet. There's even mounts you can unlock, and in itself it feels like a fun incentive to explore and go off the beaten path. Evidently, Biomutant is filled to the brim with things to do, places to explore, and stories to experience. And while content isn't everything, especially if there isn't a level of quality to it, Biomutant unfortunately falls into that category. While cool in theory, most of the features here feel stitched together with the little blemishes here and there. The combat, while backed up with an intricate crafting system, suffers from a weak lock-on system. The powers that I worked so hard to upgrade and unlock hardly leave a scratch on enemies and ultimately result in some pretty boring boss fights. Vehicles are fun to ride, but occasionally run into limitations on where they can run. In the end, there's a lot of ideas here, all stitched together, occasionally feeling like they fit well, and others just feel a bit too forced. It's the classic case of being a jack of all trades but a master of none. There's this stigma with AA publishers being visually more impressive than indies, but not as good as a AAA published game or a first party game, and I want to disregard that entirely with this. Biomutant very much looks like a full-fledged AAA production. It's a lovely looking game. Exploring this expansive world brought me to all sorts of stunning vistas, from the remains of a once bustling city to the biohazardous forest. There's beauty and destruction here. I think part of that is a choice to go for a more colorful and saturated look that makes each section of the world feel distinct and marvelous. There's a lot of style on display too. In the more combat heavy moments, for example, the choice to flash comic book like automatopoeias look great in action. In conjunction with the fast paced combat, comboing with weapons and mutated powers, the end result was stunning. I'm also happy to report that there's a robust photo mode built in. It's incredibly fun to stop mid-combat and take these awesome looking photos. I'm a strong believer in all games featuring a photo mode, and I'm happy Biomutant is part of that. In regards to performance, I played on an Xbox Series X, and while this game works on both a PS5 and a Series X, it runs on next-gen consoles through backwards compatibility, but first the base consoles. On PS4 you can expect a 1080p 30fps performance while boosting that to 1080p 60 on a PS4 Pro. Since the PS5 requires custom code to take advantage of its more powerful hardware, the PS5 essentially runs the game as a PS4 Pro at 1080p 60fps. On the Xbox side, the base Xbox One runs it at 1080p 30, while the Xbox One X targets 1080p 60. Among the last generation consoles, both the base consoles target 30fps, but occasionally dip down to the mid-20s, the Xbox One more than the PS4. On the Pro models, the Xbox One X has a more stable performance than the Pro, but both are more adequate than the base consoles. And as for next-gen performance, Xbox Series X has the best performance, taking full advantage of the hardware thanks to how Microsoft chose to run backwards compatibility on their console. The end result is a 4K 60fps that in my experience was pretty locked. It's still not native code though, so you'll see some of these textures not fully support the 4K resolution, though it only really becomes noticeable up close. If you want the best performance experience, you'll want to go with either a Series X or a PC, but even with the base model consoles, considering their age and how many years it's been since their release, Biomutant runs surprisingly well on them. Biomutant's music isn't the most stunning set of pieces, but it does a solid job at pushing that sense of discovery and exploration that complements the world design very well. Running through the meadows, there's a peaceful mellow piece for that moment, almost making the world feel like it's before the apocalypse. Of course, that changes the moment you jump into combat, which I'd argue feels like the real music in this game. I'm talking about the sounds of scraps of metal being clashed and flung around as I swing at an enemy, while another one shoots a bullet out of a makeshift gun made of junk. It's very rugged, but I kind of love it. At its core, Biomutant feels like a junkyard scrap war, and the audio spectrum here perfectly encapsulates that. What is a bit odd is the choice of a narrator. Everybody in this game speaks, although they sound more like slightly more advanced Banjo-Kazooie characters. Their dialogue is written out, but the entire conversation and story for that matter are narrated as if it's a children's story being told. It's not terrible, but just very unique, and it does ultimately work, but it took a lot to get used to it. The long-awaited Biomutant is finally here, and after playing it throughout this week, I think the wait for it was worth it in some aspects. It's not a masterpiece or a flawless game, but it's a lot of fun in some aspects and incredibly shallow in others. The RPG mechanics have a surprising amount of depth to them. The combat finds a solid balance between feeling fun to execute, though unrewarding after spending hours upgrading my powers. The world has been completely devastated, yet it's beautiful and well worth exploring for its environments alone. But I wish I could say the same for its stories. Some further optimizations and polishing would have been nice, along with a more rich main quest storyline, but overall the package here is very okay. Biomutant is incredibly ambitious as it tries to mix and match a variety of genres that feel like it could have worked had it been executed better. Thank you very much for watching my review. I hope you guys found it useful and informative. Are you picking up Biomutant, and if so, on which platform? I'm very excited to see everyone's custom characters in the photo mode in action, so be sure to tweet me your cool protagonists or photos. Anyway, I gotta get back to playing Miitopia for review, but until that video review is done, I'll see you in the comments down below or over on my Discord server. The link is in the description.